Big Shaq was just enjoying his day when he spotted a group of Karens ganging up on an elderly homeless man outside a fancy cafe. "Get this filth out of here," one of them screeched, dialing the cops. People stared, cameras rolled, but instead of walking away, Shaq smiled. Because he had a plan. What he did next didn't just shut them up, it made them famous for all the wrong reasons. Stay till the end, because this story will leave you speechless. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. A warm afternoon sun bathed the upscale cafe in golden light. The clinking of coffee cups and soft murmurs of conversation filled the air. Couples sipped lattes, professionals tapped away on laptops, and groups of friends laughed over brunch. Everything was peaceful until a sharp, piercing voice shattered the calm. "Excuse me, who let this filth sit here?" Heads turned. A group of three impeccably dressed women, led by Victoria, stood near the entrance, glaring at an elderly homeless man seated quietly on a bench. Walter, his frail hands clutching a worn-out backpack, lifted his head at the sudden attention. His tattered clothes hung loosely on his thin frame, and his weary eyes flickered with confusion. Karen number 2 gasped dramatically, stepping back as if Walter carried the plague. "Oh my God, he's going to bring diseases!" Walter furrowed his brows, shifting uncomfortably. He had been sitting there for hours, minding his own business, grateful just to have a place to rest. He wasn't begging, wasn't bothering anyone, but to these women his mere presence was offensive. Victoria wrinkled her nose. "I am not drinking my cappuccino with a homeless man sitting 10 feet away." She whipped out her phone. "I'm calling the cops." Walter stiffened. His grip on his backpack tightened. I'm not doing anything wrong," he murmured, his voice hoarse. Karen number 3 sneered, arms crossed. "You're bothering us. That's enough reason." Other cafe patrons exchanged uneasy glances. A few whispered amongst themselves, some looking guilty, others avoiding eye contact altogether. A young waitress, no older than 20, bit her lip and hesitated before stepping forward. He's not hurting anyone," she said timidly. Karen number 2 scoffed. "Mind your business, sweetheart, or you'll lose your job." The waitress shrank back, looking down. Victoria, pressing her phone to her ear, smirked. "Yes, officer. There's a dangerous homeless man outside our cafe. We need police immediately." Across the street, a massive black SUV rolled to a slow stop. The driver's door swung open, and out stepped a towering figure, his eyes locked onto the commotion. Walter lowered his head, gripping the straps of his old backpack as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. He had been through this before. Many times, in many places. It always played out the same way. People like Victoria and her friends saw him, judged him, and decided that his mere existence was an inconvenience. He had long since stopped fighting it. The other cafe customers shifted in their seats, uncomfortable but unwilling to speak up. Some stared at their phones, pretending not to notice, while others cast quick glances at Walter before looking away. The young waitress who had spoken earlier clenched her hands into fists at her sides. Victoria crossed her arms, her designer handbag resting against her hip as she sneered at Walter. "Honestly, this whole neighborhood is going downhill. It's about time someone cleaned it up." Karen number 2 nodded in agreement, tossing her blonde hair over her shoulder. "I mean, seriously, we work hard for the life we have, and then we have to look at this?" She waved a hand toward Walter, wrinkling her nose. The waitress took a shaky breath before whispering, "But he's not hurting anyone." Karen number 3, the shortest but loudest of the group, turned on her heels and jabbed a manicured finger in the waitress's direction. "Do you like your job, sweetie?" Her voice was dripping with condescension. "Because trust me, if you keep defending that, you won't have one much longer." The waitress flinched but stood her ground. Walter exhaled slowly. He had learned not to expect kindness, but seeing someone, anyone, try to stand up for him meant more than he could put into words. He wanted to tell the young woman not to waste her breath, that women like Victoria didn't care about right or wrong. But before he could say anything, the air suddenly changed. A deep, rumbling sound cut through the tension, the low purr of an expensive engine rolling up to the curb. Victoria turned her head just as a massive black SUV slowed to a stop. The driver's door swung open, and out stepped a towering figure. The entire cafe seemed to hold its breath. The deep rumble of an engine came to a slow stop, and the air around the cafe seemed to shift. A sleek black SUV sat idling by the curb, its tinted windows hiding whoever was inside. Conversation quieted and curious eyes turned toward the vehicle, sensing something was about to happen. The driver's door swung open, and a massive figure stepped out, casting an imposing shadow across the pavement. The man was unmistakable, towering at over 7 feet, built like a fortress, and moving with the quiet confidence of someone who commanded attention without asking for it. The second people recognized him. Murmurs spread like wildfire. "Wait a second," someone whispered. "No way! Is that Shaq?" A man in the crowd reached for his phone, nearly dropping it in his rush to start recording. A woman at a nearby table gasped, her coffee cup hovering midair as she stared in disbelief. Even the waitress, the only one who had tried to stand up for Walter, felt her breath hitch as she turned toward the giant standing before them. Shaquille O'Neal took a slow, deliberate step forward. His gaze swept across the cafe patio, taking in the scene before him. His eyes landed on Walter, still clutching his tattered backpack, his shoulders hunched in a familiar posture of defeat. The old man had been through this before. He didn't expect kindness, only more cruelty. Then Shaq's gaze shifted to Victoria and her friends. He took in their sneering expressions, the entitled way they carried themselves, their arms folded as if they had already won. They hadn't noticed him yet, too caught up in their own self-righteousness. Shaq exhaled slowly through his nose, his massive arms crossing over his chest. His deep voice, steady and deliberate, cut through the air like a low roll of thunder before a storm. "Man, y'all just don't learn, do you?" Victoria's head jerked up, her eyes narrowing as if she hadn't quite registered what was happening. Annoyance flickered across her face before she fully turned around. The moment she saw who was standing there, her expression froze. The color drained from her face, her lips parting in stunned silence. The two other Karens exchanged frantic glances, their smug attitudes shifting into something closer to panic. Victoria swallowed hard. Her voice, usually sharp and cutting, wavered. Wait, what's he doing here?" The air around them grew thick with tension, and for the first time, the Karens weren't in control anymore. Victoria straightened her shoulders, flipping her blonde hair over one shoulder as she tried to regain her composure. She had spent years perfecting the art of looking down on people, and she wasn't about to let some washed-up basketball player intimidate her. Crossing her arms, she forced a smirk and tilted her chin up defiantly. "This has nothing to do with you, Mr. O'Neal," she said, drawing out his name as if she was addressing an inconvenience. Shaq didn't flinch. If anything, his expression darkened. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, his towering presence making her take a reflexive step back. His deep voice, steady and unshakable, rolled over the cafe like a warning. "Oh, but it does," he said. The weight of his words settled over the crowd. The other Karens looked at Victoria, hoping she had some kind of comeback, but for the first time she hesitated. Then from behind the counter, the young waitress who had spoken up earlier gasped. She looked between Shaq and the cafe sign, realization dawning in her wide eyes. He owns this cafe," she blurted out. The words hit like a bomb. A wave of hushed whispers spread through the customers. Phones were already recording, capturing every second of the unfolding disaster. Victoria's smirk vanished. "What?" she said, her voice cracking slightly. The second Shaq nodded, confirming it. Her confidence shattered like glass. Her gaze darted around, looking for an escape, but there wasn't one. The man she had just tried to intimidate wasn't just another celebrity. He had power here. Shaq crossed his arms over his massive chest and stared her down, his expression unreadable. "Now tell me," he said, his voice calm but firm. "What exactly is so dangerous about this man?" Victoria stammered, her usual sharp tongue failing her. Well, he shouldn't be here." The crowd gasped, their judgmental eyes now turned toward her. The tables had turned, and she was running out of excuses. The sound of distant sirens echoed down the street, growing louder with each passing second. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the glass windows of the cafe, casting an eerie glow over the scene. Conversations hushed, and all eyes turned toward the approaching police cruiser. Victoria, standing tall with an air of self-importance, folded her arms and let out a dramatic sigh, as if she had personally summoned the law to her aid. "Finally," she muttered under her breath, tapping her manicured nails against her phone. A satisfied smirk curled on her lips as she turned to the other Karens, who nodded in agreement, their expressions filled with smug anticipation. To them, this was a victory, another nuisance being removed from their perfect world. The Patrol car came to a halt, and after a brief pause, both front doors opened. Two uniformed officers stepped out, assessing the situation with practiced eyes. The lead officer, a stocky Latino man in his late 40s, adjusted his duty belt as he walked toward the group. His name tag read Ramirez, and the weary look on his face suggested he had dealt with situations like this more times than he cared to count. Before he could say a word, Victoria stormed toward him, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. She flipped her blonde hair over her shoulder, her expression contorted into one of exaggerated distress. "Officer, thank God you're here," she said, her voice high-pitched with feigned outrage. She dramatically gestured toward Walter, who sat stiffly on the bench, his hands gripping the straps of his tattered backpack. "This disgusting homeless man is loitering outside this cafe, and he refuses to leave. He's scaring people. He could be dangerous." Behind her, Karen number 2 gasped and clutched her designer purse as if Walter might lunge at her at any moment. "He's making everyone uncomfortable. We shouldn't have to tolerate this kind of filth while we're trying to enjoy our coffee." Officer Ramirez barely spared them a glance. His attention shifted to Walter, who sat in silent resignation, his weary eyes darting toward Shaq as if searching for reassurance. The officer's gaze then landed on Shaq, and his expression changed immediately. His posture stiffened slightly, his brows knitting together as recognition dawned. His partner, a younger officer standing beside him, nudged him slightly. "Wait, is that—" "Oh no," Ramirez muttered under his breath, rubbing his temple as if he already knew this was about to become much more complicated than he had anticipated. He turned back to Victoria, who was still waiting impatiently for an immediate response. "So," he said, his tone even and calm, "what exactly do you want us to do here?" Victoria huffed, looking at him as though he were an idiot for not immediately jumping into action. "Arrest him, obviously!" she practically shrieked, her arms flailing toward Walter. "Remove him! Get him out of here! He has no business being in a nice place like this." Officer Ramirez blinked at her, unimpressed. He let out a slow breath before turning toward Walter again, taking a moment to assess the situation for himself. The elderly man was quiet, clearly frightened, but not causing any disruption. His clothing was old and tattered, but there was nothing threatening about him. Ramirez exhaled sharply before crossing his arms. "Ma'am," he said, his voice firm but measured, "why exactly are we arresting him?" Victoria's confident smirk faltered. The color drained from her face, and for the first time, uncertainty flickered in her eyes. The crowd watched in silence, waiting to see what would happen next. Victoria's smug expression began to crack as murmurs rippled through the cafe crowd. People who had previously remained silent were now watching intently, waiting to see what would happen next. The weight of the moment shifted, but she refused to acknowledge it. Instead, she scoffed and rolled her eyes. "This is ridiculous," she huffed. "He's a public nuisance. Just look at him, sitting there, probably stinking up the whole place." Shaq, who had been standing silently with his arms crossed, finally let out a deep, slow chuckle. He shook his head, his massive frame towering over Victoria as he took a step closer. "Lady," he said, his voice calm but firm, "you just embarrassed yourself." Victoria's face twisted in anger. "Excuse me?" she snapped, her voice rising an octave. Shaq gestured toward Walter, who sat quietly on the bench, his grip tightening on his old backpack. "This man hasn't done anything wrong. He wasn't asking for money. He wasn't harassing anyone. He was just sitting here minding his own business." Officer Ramirez cleared his throat, stepping forward with his notepad in hand. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Victoria directly, "you called us here for an emergency, but as far as I can tell, there's no crime being committed." Karen number 2, her face red with frustration, pointed an accusing finger at Walter. "He's a menace," she screeched. "He's making everyone uncomfortable. We have rights, you know." The second officer, a younger cop with sharp eyes, raised an eyebrow. "Actually," he said slowly, flipping through his notepad, "harassment is a crime." Victoria blinked. "Well, exactly. That's what we've been trying to tell you." The officer smirked. "I wasn't talking about him." Officer Ramirez turned to the Karens, his expression suddenly much more serious. "Maybe we should be looking at you instead." Victoria's breath hitched as Officer Ramirez fixed her with a steely gaze. The confidence she had wielded so carelessly just moments ago was starting to crumble. Her perfectly manicured fingers clenched into fists as she shook her head in disbelief. "Us?" she gasped, her voice rising. You can't do that. We called the police. Shaq, standing calmly beside Walter, let out a low chuckle. He folded his massive arms across his chest and arched a brow. Oh, but they can, he said, his deep voice laced with amusement. Karen number 2, still fuming, crossed her arms. This is insane. We're the victims here. Officer Ramirez ignored the outburst and calmly flipped open his notepad. Ma'am, we have multiple witnesses who all seem to be saying the same thing. He glanced up at the cafe's patrons, who were now watching the confrontation with rapt attention. A man sitting near the entrance spoke up. They started harassing him for no reason. Another woman, still holding her half-finished latte, nodded. He was just sitting there quietly. They started yelling at him out of nowhere. One by one, the customers added their voices. They threatened to get the waitress fired just for defending him. They straight up lied to the police, trying to make him seem dangerous. Karen number 3, her face pale, stepped closer to Victoria and whispered, "We should just go." But Victoria wasn't ready to back down. Her nostrils flared as she glared at the officers. "You have no idea who you're messing with," she hissed. "Do you know who my husband is? I could have this whole place shut down tomorrow if I wanted to." Shaq smirked, tilting his head slightly. "Is that right?" Officer Ramirez's expression hardened. "Ma'am, that sounded an awful lot like a threat." Victoria's face twisted in shock as Officer Ramirez narrowed his eyes at her. The cafe had gone silent, every patron now watching the unfolding drama with bated breath. The confidence she had weaponized just moments ago was quickly slipping through her fingers. Shaq, still calm but clearly unimpressed, reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His massive fingers tapped the screen with deliberate ease. "Let me just check something real quick," he muttered. Victoria scoffed. "Oh, please. What could you possibly—" She stopped mid-sentence as Shaq turned the screen toward the crowd. The bright glare of a live video illuminated the shocked faces of the Karens. On the screen, a crystal-clear, close-up shot of Victoria's face. Mid-rant, her lips curled in disgust, her voice shrill and entitled. The video had already gone viral. The comment section was exploding. "Who is this woman? She's disgusting. Fire her. Immediately. Karma time, baby. Y'all, someone find out where she works." Karen number 3 shrieked, her hands flying to her face as if trying to hide from the screen. "Turn that off," she screamed, her voice cracking. "You can't film us without permission." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "You're in a public place," he said casually. "Besides, you're the one who wanted attention, right?" Victoria's face had gone ghostly pale. She grabbed at her phone with trembling hands, desperately typing. I can fix this. I need to call my husband. I need to—" Shaq shrugged. "Too late. The internet knows now." Her phone dinged, then again, then again. She glanced down at the screen. Email. "Victoria, we need to talk immediately." Text from her boss. "Call me, now." Social media notification. "Your account has been temporarily suspended for violating community guidelines." Her fingers went numb. Just then, another notification popped up. This time, a news headline. "Breaking: CEO's wife caught in viral video. Public calls for immediate consequences." Walter sat frozen on the cafe bench, his weathered hands clutching his tattered backpack. His wrinkled face, lined with years of hardship, bore an expression of disbelief. A few minutes ago, he was just another invisible man to the world, an easy target for cruelty. But now he was the center of attention, with one of the most famous men on the planet standing beside him. The commotion around him had begun to die down. The Karens had gone eerily silent, their smug expressions replaced with panic. The police officers, no longer focused on him, had turned their attention to Victoria's unraveling downfall. The entire cafe crowd still had their phones out, capturing every moment. But Walter? He was still trying to understand how his life had changed in the blink of an eye. Shaq crouched down to meet Walter's eyes, his presence larger than life, yet somehow gentle. "You all right, big man?" he asked, his deep voice laced with concern. Walter chuckled dryly. I don't know what to say. I've never had someone stand up for me like that." His voice cracked, betraying years of exhaustion and loneliness. Shaq grinned. "Well, let's start with this." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, crisp envelope. It was thick, its weight noticeable, as he placed it in Walter's trembling hands. Walter hesitated, his fingers running over the smooth paper. He hadn't held something this pristine in years. "What is this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Shaq just smiled. "Open it." With careful hands, Walter slid a shaky finger beneath the seal and pulled out a neatly folded document. His eyes scanned the words printed in bold letters at the top, and suddenly his breath hitched. His frail hands tightened around the paper as his vision blurred with unshed tears. His lips trembled as he looked up at Shaq. This, this says I have an apartment? His voice cracked with emotion. Shaq nodded. Not just any apartment. Your apartment, paid for. No strings attached. Walter's eyes widened further as he flipped to the next page, revealing a $10,000 check in his name. Walter's fingers trembled as he held the keys, the cold metal pressing against his palm like a dream he was afraid to wake from. His vision blurred, and he swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing. For years, he had learned to expect nothing, to live with the harsh reality of being ignored, shunned, and discarded like he was nothing more than an inconvenience. But now here he was, staring at proof that someone as larger than life as Shaquille O'Neal, actually cared. He blinked rapidly, glancing down at the paper in his other hand. His eyes skimmed over the words again, reading them over and over as if expecting them to change. Tenant, Walter James. Address, 214 Crescent Avenue. A real home. A place to sleep that wasn't a cold bench or the hard pavement. A door that locked. A bed, a kitchen. A fresh start. I can't accept this, Walter stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head, looking up at Shaq with watery eyes. This is too much, son. I don't deserve this. Shaq's deep chuckle rumbled through the air. Too late, he said, folding his arms with a knowing smirk. Lease is already in your name. Walter let out a shaky laugh, disbelieving. You serious? Shaq nodded. Dead serious. That's your place now. Rent-free. And that check? That's for whatever you need to get started. Furniture, clothes, food. No more struggling. The crowd around them had fallen silent, their earlier whispers now replaced with stunned admiration. Even the cafe customers who had previously hesitated to speak up were now wiping away tears or nodding in approval. Victoria and her group of Karens stood stiffly a few feet away, their faces pale with shock and resentment. Everything had backfired on them. Instead of humiliating Walter, they had just watched him receive a blessing beyond anything they could have imagined. Walter let out a heavy breath and stared down at the keys again, turning them over in his palm as if afraid they might disappear. I don't even know how to thank you, he whispered. Shaq placed a massive hand on Walter's shoulder, his expression warm but firm. Just promise me one thing, he said. Walter looked up, eyes still glistening. Anything, Shaq smiled. Pay it forward one day. Walter nodded, gripping the keys tighter, determined that one day he would. Victoria's manicured fingers clenched around her phone as the screen lit up with an incoming message. The name at the top sent a chill down her spine. Mr. Patterson, CEO. Her throat tightened as she tapped it open, her perfectly glossed lips parting in shock as she read the short, brutal text. We've seen the video. This is not the image our company represents. Don't bother coming in tomorrow. You're done. Her breath hitched, and for a moment, the world around her blurred. The laughter, the whispers, the judgmental eyes of the cafe patrons all became a deafening hum in the back of her mind. She felt dizzy, like the ground had been ripped from beneath her. This can't be happening, she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. Karen number 2 peeked over her shoulder, her own eyes widening. Wait, they fired you? Karen number 3 took a step back, as if distancing herself from the sinking ship that was Victoria's reputation. Oof, that's rough. Victoria's face twisted in pure rage. With a furious shriek, she hurled her phone onto the cafe floor. The screen shattered on impact, the sound echoing through the stunned silence. You're all gonna regret this, she spat, spinning toward Shaq. You ruined my life. You and that disgusting... Shaq didn't move. He simply raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable but powerful enough to silence her mid-rant. Ruined your life? Shaq repeated, his voice dangerously calm. Nah, you did that all by yourself. The cafe doors swung open suddenly, and a few reporters rushed in, cameras at the ready. Victoria barely had time to react before the flashes started. Victoria, care to comment on your actions? One journalist asked. Is it true your company dropped you? Another pressed. Do you have any regrets? Victoria turned pale. She grabbed her purse and spun on her heel, shoving past them as she stormed toward her car, her heels clicking violently against the pavement. Shaq watched her go, then smirked and lifted a hand in an exaggerated wave. Have a nice life, Karen. Victoria's tires screeched as she sped off, straight into a dead-end alley. Walter stood frozen, staring down at the keys in his trembling hands. The small metal pieces felt heavier than anything he had ever held, not because of their weight, but because of what they meant. A home, safety, a second chance. Tears welled in his tired eyes as he slowly looked up at Shaq, his voice cracking. I don't even know what to say. Shaq placed a massive hand on Walter's frail shoulder, his voice warm but firm. Then don't say anything, man. Just live your life. You deserve this. The cafe erupted into applause. Strangers, people who had once ignored Walter's presence, were now cheering, clapping, even wiping their own tears away. Some were pulling out their phones, capturing the moment, broadcasting it to the world. A young woman in a waitress uniform stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry, sir, for not speaking up sooner. Walter smiled at her, his eyes kind. You're speaking up now. That's what matters. Behind them, Victoria's furious footsteps echoed down the sidewalk as she stormed toward her car, her face still flushed with rage and humiliation. She had spent years building her reputation, priding herself on being admired, feared, and untouchable. And now the internet knew who she truly was. Reporters swarmed her, flashing cameras in her face. Victoria, any comment on today's events? Victoria, do you regret your actions? She shoved past them, yanking open her car door. Get out of my way. I don't owe any of you an explanation. With a furious screech of her tires, she sped off, her once glamorous life crumbling behind her. Shaq watched her go, then turned back to Walter, a smirk tugging at his lips. That's what we call karma, baby. Walter let out a raspy chuckle, shaking his head in disbelief. Never thought I'd see the day. Shaq grinned and turned toward the crowd, raising his voice so everyone could hear. Let this be a lesson to all of us. You don't gotta be rich to deserve respect. You don't gotta be famous to deserve kindness. He glanced toward the cafe workers, the customers, even the reporters. And you sure as hell don't need to have a home to deserve dignity. The crowd roared in agreement. Walter clutched his keys tightly, his heart lighter than it had been in years. For the first time in a long time, he had something he thought he'd lost forever. Hope. Victoria disappeared from the public eye, while Walter walked toward a new beginning, his head held high.